So our next session is reflections on alternative proteins. If everyone could please sit down so we don't run late, and then we can pick up all these conversations at the reception. Surrounded by, yeah. So I hope you'll resume the conversations when we go to the reception at 4, which has some interesting photos in the art galleries. You'll be surrounded by beef and microbes, both of which make protein. So it should be an interesting experience after our conversation here. So the next session is going to address questions of what kinds of meat alternatives are being developed and what do they promise environmentally and can they make good on those promises. And our speaker will be Julie Guthman, who's an author on Weighing In and Wilted. She's also a professor of social sciences at UC Santa Cruz, where she teaches multiple courses on the politics of food and agriculture. And I just want to say as an aside, as a Berkeley graduate and long-term resident of California, the number of people doing excellent work that came from the UC system is really something to be proud of, and it's a public education. So back to Julie in particular, with a research emphasis on the conditions of the possibilities for food system transformation in the United States, her prior publications include 3 multi-award winning monographs, an edited collection, and over 40 articles in peer-reviewed journals. She's currently heading up the After Project, a multi-campus collaboration of the University of California, exploring the cultural and political economic influences on the emerging Bay Area food and agri-food technology sectors, and how entrepreneurs are defining problems and solutions and responding to public concerns. Julie's going to now present some of her research findings, and I hope you find it fascinating, as the whole day has been, at least for me so far.
Let me time myself. Well, thank you I have everything I need. Thank you for including me at this really stimulating event. I'm learning and thinking about a lot. So much of what we've been talking about today involves, I would say, indicators of the ecological and nutritional effects of livestock production. And we've also been discussing the ethics of reducing or eliminating meat from our diets. But so far we've not really discussed alternatives to meat, including products being developed simply to deliver more protein, whether it even looks or seems like meat. So that's what I'm here to do, to discuss what's being called alternative proteins. And many of these are coming from the tech sector, with the tech sectors always making claims of their potential to disrupt conventional livestock production and the companies behind it. So I'm referring to a range of products, including insect-based foods, protein-enhanced snack foods, cellular meat, and the plant-based meat products, most famously the Beyond and Impossible burgers that many of you have heard about. And the latter two in particular promise the meat experience without the animal, and engineers have worked hard to make them look like, taste like, smell like, bleed like, and cook like meat, positioning them as the optimal solution in the face of what appears as an inevitable growing demand for meat-like protein. So I've been tracking these alternative proteins as part of this larger project that is investigating Silicon Valley's interest in food and agriculture, a sector that the techies find is underinvested. We dubbed it the After Project. This was an acronym we came up with in a bar, but we're besides a shower, all good ideas come. We are a collaboration of 3 UC campuses, and the questions we're exploring, including what motivates the tech sector's involvement, how techies are defining problems and solutions, how they imagine they are responding to public concerns, and how they think they're going to make any money on this, since food and agriculture tend to be not profitable, at least on the production side. So the ways we've been doing this is we've developed a database of all sorts of companies and their products. We've been attending a lot of pitch events and conferences, and we've been interviewing entrepreneurs and accelerators and incubators, venture capitalists, and other industry bigwigs. One thing that has struck us, particularly in the alternative protein space, as they call it, is the amount and kind of promissory talk about alternative proteins materializations. And by that term, I'm referring to the processes that source inputs will undergo to become what is allegedly edible protein. And here we see promises that the tech world can produce protein from A, near nothing, B, from the very mundane, C, from overwhelming abundance, or D, from waste. So they're promising products or proteins with significantly less environmental impact than protein derived from livestock production. In other words, they're promising protein that will come free of charge environmentally. At the same time, they promise that these products will be at least as edible, digestible, bioavailable, and desirable as meat, and potentially more nutritious and safe than meat. The question is if it's possible to make good on these promises. It's really hard to know, because what we found is that a lot of these are speculative ventures, and they're further obscured by the proprietary processes that make them investable. So there's reason to be skeptical of these promises. So what I want to do in the next 30 or so minutes is to do this. One is I want to categorize these products in terms of the kind of promises that are being made regarding how they will become materialized. Two, I want to talk about what is being obscured in these promises, and here I'm drawing somewhat on reports of what these products might mean ecologically and nutritionally, but here I'm not going to present you with a bunch of statistics or studies or counter studies, because I think one of the points of this, and one of the points we're hearing today, is the science is always contested. And then I want to end by discussing why this approach and not, say, the diet for a small planet approach. And it is here that I will bring attention to some of the political economic aspects of the alternative protein phenomenon. So what's being done in the name of protein? So we've come up with the following categories of how protein is transformed, derived, or manufactured from sources of protein that are putatively abundant, or mundane, or undervalued, or minuscule. These categories are imperfect and overlapping. We're still working on them. And there's many products that combine two or more of these processes. So I'm introducing them with some pure examples to draw attention to the specific promises of transformations from source material to product. And in making these distinctions, I purposely use terms that evoke the language of the companies. It is worth noting that many companies use the term harvest, no doubt in contrast to the more violent word slaughter, but harvest is probably too broad of a term to apply here. So let me walk you through some examples. One is about growing, or what we've been calling something from nothing. So something from virtually nothing is one of the core promises of the bioeconomy, premised on the idea that biological growth is infinite, while geophysical resources are finite. Cellular meat is very much in keeping with this approach, based on the idea that you can grow actual meat cells without the animal. And the idea behind this technology is to produce actual meat without the animals, in addition to avoiding the inhumane conditions and slaughter of industrial livestock production. Cellular meat promises reduced greenhouse gas emissions and a healthier product. And the health promise derives from the absence of antibiotic use, as well as the aspiration to engineer leaner and thus ostensibly more heart-healthy meat. The process itself entails taking marble-sized amounts of stem cell tissue from living animals from which individual cells are isolated. The cells are then put in mediums in plastic flasks from which nutrients, and given nutrients, oxygen, and moisture, allowing the cells to divide exponentially. And once the cells stop dividing, they are moved to bioreactors where they can begin to mature into muscle fibers and fat cells. Apparently, it's relatively easy to combine these cells to create processed meat products like hamburgers and sausages and hot dogs. To simulate structured cuts of meat like steak or chicken breast and bacon is a much more difficult process. They've begun to experiment with various biomaterials to replicate the structure and function of blood vessels and other connective issues. And some of the materials they're trying to use include cellulose from plants and carbohydrates derived from mushrooms or algae. Okay, next category, something from the mundane, or converting plants to meat. Converting plant material into meat, dairy, or egg simulacra is also getting lots of attention, in large part because it's been going on longer and therefore has yielded successful commercial products like the Beyond Burger, like the Impossible Burger. But these promise something much different than the veggie burgers of yore made of beans, nuts, and much else, the kind that I had to grow up on. The idea here is to use more mundane and protein-rich plant materials such as soy and peas and engineer them to replicate the taste and texture of meat, eggs, or dairy. Impossible Burger is perhaps the most interesting of these because genetic engineering is used to make it bleed with a product called heme. So specifically, they engineer leg hemoglobin, which releases a protein called heme, which looks, tastes, and smells like blood. And one of the interesting promises that underpins plant-based meat is that there's going to be a more direct relationship between plant and eater, cutting out the middle animal, as it were. A third process we're seeing is something from abundance, or sometimes they use the term ferment. So ferment is used by the industry to describe processes that make food, or at least food ingredients, out of yeast, bacteria, and other ubiquitous microorganisms, generally not recognized as food, often through acellular bioengineering. So basically they use living organisms or enzymes to work on other raw material to transform them into food-like products. Here the promise is something from abundance. So one example is using yeast to make dairy protein. The company Perfect Day, used to be called Mufri, adds milk genes to microflora, ferments them to convert plant sugar into milk proteins like whey and casein, and then uses these in fabricating ice cream. More a proof of concept than an intended product, the first batch of ice cream produced by Perfect Day was $20 a pint, and it sold out immediately. I don't know, I didn't taste it. It sold out immediately, never got there. There's another company based in Colorado called Emergy Foods, and it's fermenting filamentous fungi to make steaks. They're using fast-growing microorganisms that branch quickly into thread-like networks of cell called mycelium. They feed them on sugar water that they hope to eventually get from beer manufacturers. In this case, the fungi are not a processing agent like in the other kind of fermentation things, but the final product. So they actually hope to have the fungi be the steak. Some companies are even attempting to make protein out of thin air. I kid you not. There's a company called Caverdi that's working on recycling CO2 into bio-based products. Apparently they use a special class of microbes that can produce oils and proteins. One of their first products was called Planet Plus Protein, and it supposedly contains over 50% more protein than many other animal-based proteins. Then we see upcycling, something from waste. So upcycling is about recovering proteins from byproducts with the goal of minimizing waste. The company Planetarians is recovering protein from seeds defatted in cooking oil production. They've developed a high pressure, high temperature extruding technology that sterilizes, destroys anti-nutrients, and makes insoluble fiber more palatable. The end product is a high protein, high fiber meal used in crackers, pizza crusts, and snacks. There's another company called Regrain that quote unquote rescues grain from brewing and upcycles it into flour used for similar products. And I guess that this other category, still working with them, is something from the underutilized. Well, maybe we can name it as Discover. And here I'm referring to using less known, underutilized resources of food and adding them to conventional food. Insect-based proteins may be the example par excellence. Interest in insect-based protein is guided by the assumption that insects are superabundant and already part of human diets. Insects allegedly have a much higher feed conversion efficiency rate than mammalian protein, meaning that the food that they eat nearly directly increases their body mass. Now, the process of creating protein products from insects is clearly less complex than some of the other ones I've been discussing, because it basically involves dry roasting and milling these insects and then making it into a flour or a powder that can be used in baked goods and snacks and energy bars, etc. Now, it turns out some of these sources that are being discovered do involve more complex process. So getting some attention is the larvae of the black soldier fly, which you can see on the right of that, otherwise known as maggots. So the black soldier's fly larvae also ostensibly has the ability to transform all manner of organic waste, cafeteria refuse, manure, even toxic algae into high-quality protein, and in doing so leaving a smaller carbon footprint than it found. So far, maggot-based protein is being developed as food for animals, including livestock, but a professor of entomology at Texas A&M said the industry could, quote, save lives, stabilize economies, create jobs, and protect the environment, unquote, if only it weren't so yucky sounding. So as you've seen in this really brief overview, across these products are being framed as what they are not. They're not resource intensive. They're not wasteful. They're not scarce. Virtually all in that way are promising to minimize protein's materializations. If not exactly something from nothing, something from very little, often in the name of environmental benefit. I've also hope you've noticed some of the graphics depicting the processes that companies use. They all suggest very simple transformations. But what is being obscured in these promises? What aspects of the materializations of these products are not part of the promises? So what follows, I introduce you to some of the most common aspects that are obscures. Please note that these cross-cut many of the categories I've been discussing. Make sure I'm on the right slide. I want to begin by noting that the promise of something from nothing seems to defy the first law of thermodynamics. That law states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Energy only can be transferred or changed from one form to another. That would then suggest a process of displacement from one site to another, rather than something from little. But the point I want to draw here, or the more important point, is that biological growth of any kind doesn't just happen. It requires food. Take cellular meat, promised on the idea that you can grow the meat from itsy-bitsy cells and produce vast quantities of meat. But to grow meat, you need to feed those cells with sugars and other protein building blocks. Where will those come from, and how much will be needed, and where will the waste from that go? As I learned about this just recently, there's a lot of waste that comes from even the use of microbes. There's the questions of infrastructures. To grow, you not only need to feed these microbes and such, or feed these cells, you need to have infrastructures within which they'll grow. One candid person I met from a company called Memphis Meats said that it would take a bioreactor the size of a whale to feed one hamburger to every person in San Francisco just once a week. Okay? And since these bioreactors provide circulations of nutrients and gas and control for contamination, they are extremely energy intensive. So to grow meat for larger populations, we'd have landscapes of energy intensive bioreactors rather than greenhouse gas emitting CAFOs. Nor do insects, for insect-based foods, just arrive in a box. Built on a premise of abundance, it is worth noting that the makers of insect-based foods are not just harvesting them from nature, which would be extremely difficult, but they are growing them in factory-like conditions. There's a place called Tiny Farms in Oakland, California. They built a cricket rearing system in a former automobile plant, and they claim to have an energy smart system for growing the crickets and processing the crickets into cricket protein powder. But how do we know? How do we evaluate their claims of energy efficiency? A third issue that's being obscured is where some of the source ingredients will come from and how will they be produced. The core ingredients in some of the plant-based proteins may be mundane, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily widely available or that growing them is harmless. Now, soy has so far been the protein substitute of choice, but it's highly controversial, as we all know, because of the production processes of soy that involve monocropping, generally using genetically modified seeds, and the widespread use of glyphosate, which is now taking it on the chin for its toxicity. And soy has also been the object of concerns about health since it stimulates production of estrogen. And it's somewhat ironic that the soy-based proteins such as soy milk and tofu are being replaced by these new products that are also contain soy. So while the Impossible Burger uses soy, several other alternative protein companies are planning on using peas or already using peas, including Beyond Meat. But where are all those peas going to come from? Big players are ramping up supply. Apparently, Canada is expected to produce 30% of the peas for the plant-based proteins. Some companies are already working with farmers to make sure they have contracts, supply chains. But we have big questions of whether this pea production will be sustainable. So far, it's proving difficult to find peas not grown with the highly controversial glyphosate. Also elided in these promises is the degree of processing involved in many of these products. To render pea protein, so to convert plants to animal-like products requires fractionation. Pea protein isolate is a byproduct of a very complex process. As depicted on the left side of that slide, it involves extraction at high heat, acidification, and the use of a lot of water. In the case of upcycling, it takes biological, chemical, or electrical processes to derive protein and or to make it shelf stable. It's hard to know the effects of these processes on human health. The World Health Organization has said that eating heme, the key ingredient in the Impossible Foods burger that makes it bleed, is linked with the formation of carcinogens in the gut. A toxic solvent called hexane is routinely used to extract oil and separate protein in oil seeds. According to the Cornucopia Institute, many existing non-organic meat alternatives are probably made from hexane extracted soy, and they expect that many of these new alternatives are as well. Finally, the promises obscure how consuming protein in these highly unconventional ways will materialize in human bodies. Importantly, these protein alternatives are premised on the idea that all protein is equivalent and easily substitutable. A protein is a protein is a protein. Indeed, many of our research subjects talk about protein, in quotes, agnostic of source. They thus assume a highly molecularized version of what protein is and how it acts, an extreme form of what Australian food scholar Georgie Skrinis calls nutritional reductionism. By this he means that foods are valued in terms of their biochemical composition rather than relationally and in the context of whole diets. But it appears that the techies are very taken with their own discourses about nutritional equivalency, As far as I know, the only people drinking or eating Soylent, a meal replacement product, are techies at their desks and adventurers who want to blog about how a steady diet of Soylent made them feel. If you read the blogs, apparently very sick. The serious question here is whether these proteins can act as foods in terms of edibility, digestibility, and bioavailability, let alone taste, texture, and visual attractiveness, the aspects of food that give us pleasure. They are promoted as if humans haven't co-evolved with the foods we eat. Can we eat insects in mass quantities as opposed to as delicacies, as they are currently eaten? Can we digest and make use of that much pea protein isolate? Will water lentil hydrolysate ingredient used in some meat analogs as a substitute to the allergens associated with pea and soy be any less irritating? Dogs may be the canary in the coal mine. Dog foods are now an object of tech investment in alternative proteins. I spoke to one entrepreneur who was using DNA protein to make dog food without animals. As he put it, his company doesn't have to worry about making the product look like it bleeds, or that it cooks like food, or that it is sufficiently masculine, because, in his words, dogs will eat everything. In my own experience, I can say that dogs will eat socks for sure, but I'm not sure about highly fabricated pea protein, or that they will digest it. Not that the socks went down all that well either. In short, all of these alternatives have significant materializations. Although many promise cutting out the animal and creating a direct, more efficient relationship between source material and eater, these transformations are not simple. They involve farms, laboratories, and factories that are themselves resource intensive and potentially toxic. Yet, as you've seen, many of the websites of these companies provide cartoonish depictions of their processes, when in fact their processes are truly non-transparent. So that being the case, there are many unanswered questions about how bringing any of these alternative proteins to scale might look like environmentally, whether in monocrop peas or landscapes of bioreactors or insect factories. And there are lots of unanswered questions about how they will act as food, whether consumers will eat them, digest them, get necessary nutrition from them, and not be harmed. But it's not only the narratives of their promotional material that obscures the answer to some of these questions. There are legal institutions. To be sure, many of these entrepreneurs have applied for patent protection for these processes. And of course, patents exist to make sure that the processes will not be easily replicated, so to create non-market advantages to those who are successful. So that patenting also makes them non-transparent to those who might want to know how these things are produced. So with even less transparency than conventional animal production, their representations provide very little insight into their nutritional and ecological effects. It is therefore near impossible to provide a robust assessment of how and whether these products will be more sustainable, much less as edible, digestible, or bioavailable as animal proteins. So let me be really clear, I am in no way defending confined livestock operations. They are inhumane, and they do emit millions and possibly billions of tons of greenhouse gases. What I'm suggesting is that there may not be a lot more to the alternatives than the promise. Let me put that differently. What I'm suggesting is that there may be a lot more to the alternatives than the promissory narratives suggest. Not only might some of them never deliver, they are hardly something from nothing. So the last question I want to address today then is why they have been posed as a solution to the problems with growing demand for meat. So some tentative answer. I think I might only do one here. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do both. So one is what I call solutionism. Borrowing on Evgeny Morozov, a critic of Silicon Valley culture. So as a rule, he and others have pointed out that the tech sector is fascinated with solutions. After all, it's peopled by designers and engineers, and the way funding works makes promising an impact an imperative. So a lot of the people that are developing these technologies are less concerned with understanding the problems that they are trying to solve, such as the nature of food insecurity, and or whether even producing more food is the best way to address it, or whether across the board meat reduction makes sense ecologically and nutritionally, or for that matter, whether we need more protein. So we see a lot of tail wagging the dog, entrepreneurs landing on some sort of technological fix and then working backwards to identify the problem it solves, problems going looking for solutions. But the main thing that drives this is these alternative protein products have become targets of major investment. And I would argue that what makes them investable is precisely the non-transparent transformation the source materials must undergo. Indeed, that these processes are black box, often under patent protection, is critical to their valuation in these markets. So among other things, the proprietary aspects of food tech gives lie to the notion that these products are there to address world food insecurity any more than proprietary genetically engineered seed is. This is just a map of kind of all of it. I'm sure it's already been outdated 3 times since I put this on a slide, but there's so much activity going on in these alternative proteins. And because they are, for now, attractive investments, the incumbents are getting in on them. Major fast food chains such as McDonald's, Burger King, Carl's Jr., and Subway are featuring Impossible and Beyond burgers. Tyson and Cargill have made major investments in cellular meat technologies as well as pea proteins. Now, whether they're investing in them because of the potential payoff or to hedge their bets and possibly sink them is unclear. But one thing it does is it allows these novel proteins to work alongside of rather than disrupt conventional meat. Finally, they are guided by the imaginary of non-sacrifice, of having one's cake and eating it too. Not incidentally a phrase found on many company websites. High-tech mimicry appears to address the challenges of livestock production without the need for changing habits, consumer habits or production habits. And this is precisely, well, it changes production habits. This is precisely this is precisely the kind of mindset identified by the food historian Warren Belasco in his book about the future of food. He talks about a struggle between technological fixes and what he called anthropological fixes, the need to change expectations and lifestyles. So these tech alternative proteins are in some way the perfect antidote to Diet for a Small Planet. For those of you who aren't familiar, this book, written in the 1970s, Adele alluded to it indirectly. It called for vegetarian diets in order to save natural resources and have enough food to feed all. And it's pictured in the accompanied recipe book. Now, note that this book was popular in the moments of oil and food shortages that characterized the 1970s, leading to calls for restrained lifestyles. And as others have argued, much of the high-octane consumerism that defined the 1980s was a response to this 1970s period of restraint. But the thing is, Diet for a Small Planet promoted grains, beans, and pulses, not processing, not proprietary technologies, and certainly not having it all. As it was then, it remains an apparently unattractive imaginary, hard to sell to consumers, and anathema to investors. Now, I would say, I've been thinking about it today in terms of regenerative agriculture because I would normally say the same thing about regenerative agriculture because it's not, I wouldn't think it would be particularly investable because like any other integrative system, it requires a lot more investment in keeping the farm biodiverse and less ability to offload your externalities. But apparently regenerative agriculture is attracting a lot of Silicon Valley type investment, and I'm fascinated by that, but I don't have a lot more to say about that right now. But what both suggested is that the simple solutions of substituting meat with more salads, sauteed veggies, beans and grains, or classic veggie burgers like my mother used to make because my father was a health fooder from way back when, or regenerative agriculture may indeed be the true disruption. So I'm going to leave it to the techies to think about that, and we'll move to the stage and take your questions and comments. Okay, I did it. Oh, yes. Many things to bring, yeah. Oh, God, now I have to move.
So one of the things I've been asked to remind you of is that if you want to ask some questions, remember that the website is www.pace.edu/meetqs. It'd be great to get a few more questions up here. I thought there's one question here that I think is particularly interesting, which is that a question about the level of transparency. So we've had a lot of problems with transparency in terms of factory farms as well. And this is a really interesting question. Do you think ag-gag laws are going to be applicable to these? Have you heard anything about that?
I've not heard anything about ag-gag logs, but I think there's a big difference here, which is that it's very hard to patent a lot of what goes on in conventional livestock production. Right, so you need ag-gag logs because you don't have the ability to patent.
By the way, ag-gag laws are laws that say you cannot talk about or film animal slaughterhouse operations, or and that's true in a number of different states now, that you can't, that it's illegal to talk about and record or document the processes of animal livestock production.
The one thing is we do have a lot of ethnographers getting into livestock operations and undercover journalists that I think we know more about conventional livestock production than we know about any of these. I mean, obviously these are very new, but yeah.
Yes. So here's another very good question here, which is, is there a similarity between, so you see this plant-based and the cultured meat sectors? Do you distinguish between the two of them, or do you see notable differences?
Well, they're clearly different in terms of what kind of material they're working with.
In terms of their structure, their culture, their investments.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, plant-based proteins are a reality. They already exist. Some of them have already having widespread commercial success. Cellular meat is still in the pipe dream phases. I mean, they're certainly doing experimentation with it. And there's some companies that claim that they will have products out within a few years, probably more of the sausage or chicken McNugget kind rather than of the steak kind. But like somebody said, you couldn't do a fake chicken McNugget with plant-based. No one would know the difference because it's mainly the fried dough. But I think one of the things that the cellular meat, I mean, they're hugely different. They're different in a lot of different ways. They're different in a lot of different ways. That's such a lame way to put it. There's, in terms of who's investing, I mean, the investment landscape looks very much the same. Venture capital gives money. The incumbents look around and see what looks promising and they'll invest. But I think the technologies are substantially different. And one of the things I want to say about cellular meat, and this is more of a comment on the agri-food sector in general, is there's a lot of activity going on, and it ranges from the very mundane to, maybe providing farmers more technologies by which to visualize their fields so they can use fewer chemicals in that patch of the field if they have better visualization, to cellular meat, to this like CO2 based proteins. And so some of them are really mundane and some of them are really like what we call moonshots. And part of me feels like the moonshot technologies are there performatively to make the sector look like it's bigger and more important than it is, that the more mundane technologies are the ones that are most going to be adopted, but the other ones exist to create a lot of
excitement.
excitement and hype around the sector. So, yeah.
Good. And so this is kind of another kind of technical question, but I want to ask it in terms of they want to know, this question wants to know like what kinds of approvals do companies have to follow. But I want to ask a broader question of a question we've been asking a lot in this in today, which is the role of government.
Yeah.
So in terms of approvals, in terms of transparency, in terms of some of the other issues that you brought
Yeah,
up.
I mean, that's a really good question. On the cellular meat, I should say that many in the sector are very concerned about public reaction, particularly to cellular meat. I mean, they're all living and working under the specter of GMOs and what the public's reaction was to that. And so they're trying to get in front of that. They're trying to get in front of it in a number of ways, some which are contradictory, including, making it just seem like the real thing and marketing it as a real thing at the same time being disruptive. But one of the ways they're trying to get ahead of it with cellular meat is to work with incumbents to learn about the regulatory processes. So one of the reasons that Tyson has been involved in cellular meat is to help smooth the way for regulation. And they're I don't know what the current status is, but they were trying to get cellular meat approved in the same way that GMOs were approved, which is a product, not process way of regulating it. So one of the reasons that GMOs became possible in the U.S. compared to Europe is they said, well, if you GMO a tomato, if you genetically engineer a tomato and it looks like and tastes like a conventionally made tomato, then it's fine, as opposed to what the processes were. So you could say if cellular meat looks like, tastes like kind of regular meat, then it's generally recognized as safe. So that's the kind of avenue they're trying to do in terms of regulation.
Which is pretty amazing considering
pretty
how different
amazing.
it is. Yes.
But that's because, I mean, when you have our current administration, that shouldn't be too difficult. I mean, they don't, the regret, one of the reasons that genetically engineering was underregulated is because the U.S. didn't want to get behind on that revolution because they'd gotten behind on the electronics revolution in the 70s. And so that's why they came up with protocols for biotech regulation that were to smooth the way. And so they learned from that and they want to smooth the way for this.
So this is we often try to train our students not to think in terms of bifurcations. And I have a good bifurcation question here, which is that it feels like much of today has been centered on two-sidedness, these two sides, a two-sided scale is what it, and that we have to end up on one side. But I see an opportunity in the middle, and is there one? So I think that's a broader question for the whole conference. But I also wanted to ask it in terms of the issue of plant-based meat. And is plant-based meat, because I think a lot of people think of plant-based meat as something that might be in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really harkens back to the last panel, is that I think the question is not the technology per se, but the social arrangements that go around it. And so the question is, I mean, there was always a question with genetically engineered crops, if you could separate the technology from the social relations of the buyout of the land-grant universities and the proprietary rights around them, et cetera. If you can divorce the social relations, the legal relations of production from the actual thing you're producing, and what would we have accepted GM if those could be divorced? But many people think they can't be. So the question with plant-based proteins is, can you produce these without the kind of proprietary rights, without the kind of the corporate consolidation? And so in that way, if those things are not intrinsically related, then maybe there's room. In my mind, there's more room for them. I still think it begs the question of the degree of processing that goes into them. I mean, really, if we could just be eating veggie burgers with the walnuts and lentils and rice that were made in the 1970s, I mean, why does it really, really need to taste like, bleed like, smell like a real burger? Now, these companies are not going for the die-hard vegan market or vegetarian market. They're going for the so-called flexitarian market, people who want to reduce their meat consumption, but they can't give up the burger. So, where was
So it's interesting that in this in this back and forth conversation, you've brought up GM,
Yeah.
genetic modification, quite a bit, and of which only the Impossible Burger is the one that has genetically modified ingredients. Although I suspect that they're massively trying to genetically modify these bugs as well.
Well, but the
and the
soy,
algae.
the soy that goes into
Oh,
plant-based
and then, okay,
burger.
good point, good point, yes, yes. So, but do you feel like, it kind of sounds like you're saying that the whole process by which we accepted genetically modified food kind of created a path by which we are also, that the companies are going along to have us accept these kinds of foods as well?
Well, they're more worried about that we haven't accepted them. And so they're trying to get ahead of public non-acceptance. One of the things they do is like appeal to science. They say if people only understood, these are just the same, but they're not just the same. So they have a lot of different tactics. On one hand, producing these as saying or representing them as completely similar, but on the other hand, they want to say this is disruptive and it's different. So it's this kind of set of contradictions that this sector is always operating under, which is we want it to be familiar and just like we used to eat before, but also we need to raise money from venture capital. We need to tell you it's disruptive and it's going to be world changing. So, but that's the tension that they're walking all the time, and I do think that the still existing contestation over GE crops is part of what's shaping that debate.
So that's it. So okay. So this is also a very interesting question that that's I'd be curious how you would weigh in on this. But how likely are these alternative meats, right? How likely are these going to be the production be exported to countries with lower labor costs and less environmental regulation? Does this seem like something that's going to move protein production out of the United States?
I mean, that's a very good question, and one that I honestly haven't contemplated too much. I mean, I do think that one of the other arenas of investment in the sector imagines food production without labor, the touchless harvest. That's how they sell robotics. And so that there's obviously there's different entrepreneurs trying to sell different things, and there's some people that are operating with the sector's interest in mind, but there's tensions there. But I do think they imagine there'll be very little labor. Now and I just want to say that some of the, I mean, I work mainly in California agriculture. I just wrote a book on strawberries, which is one of the most labor-intensive crops there is, and much different. We've been talking about the labor in soy, and we can talk about the labor in factory farming, but much of it's automated. But some of the worst labor in animal production, even though there's not a lot of people laboring in it, it's some of the very worst labor. So I think but I still think there's an imagination that there won't be a lot of labor involved in these because they are more amenable to industrial processes.
So I just want to note that there's a quick question about, have you ever been on a diet and which one works for you? And I think I would say that the answer to that is you should read Julie Guthman's book, Weighted. Weighing in. I'm putting Wilted and Weighing In together there.
There you go. It's all one book.
Yes. Or the article we wrote together.
Yes.
And on the politics of obesity.
And dieting.
Yes. Good. So, yes, so thank you very much.